How's everyone doing? Good, cool. So my name is Kate, and I'll start off with kind of a sadder story. In 2009, my grandfather was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I spent the next 10 years watching his decline. And during this time, at around 15, I actually asked my mother, is there such thing as kids' Alzheimer's? Which she laughed and reassured me, no, there isn't. And it was gratifying, but also I couldn't take the feeling that I was missing something. I've always had a bad memory, always. When I was in Girl Scouts, I remember hearing my troop leaders talking about me, and they called me the girl who forgets and loses everything, which stuck with me for a while. When I was in 4th grade, I managed to lose a piece of homework on a picnic table with literally no wind. Frankly, my ability to lose and forget things borders on impressive. If I had a penny for every time I've lost or forgotten something, I would be on a yacht drinking champagne from Italy with Beyonce. Though to be fair, I probably would have forgotten to hire a captain. So then I would be known as the girl who forgets and loses everything and also drowned Beyonce. Throughout my life, I've been called careless, all over the place, immature, entitled, unreliable, and told that if I just slowed down and paid more attention, I'd get it all together. The confusing thing was, I knew I cared. I cared so much and was so embarrassed about these character faults that I ended up developing intense anxiety over making sure that I didn't screw up everything that I did. I started apologizing before even starting things, just in case I'd somehow managed to screw it up already. I'm sorry, speaking of memory, just give me a second. So I started apologizing before it even started, just in case I managed to screw something up already. And I got so used to being known as a flake and a failure that it just became my normal. But somehow, after creating system after system after system after system, and every time one inevitably would fail, I would create a new one. Somehow I managed to graduate high school with a combination of high-quality late work, apology emails, and anxiety-induced insomnia, and made it to Quest. Unsurprisingly, I was drawn to the idea of studying one subject at a time. It was a dream to me. But again, it was my normal. I was so used to being seen this way, and I tried so hard to make all of these struggles invisible that I didn't even think about them as really being a problem until about 5 months ago when I sat in a psychiatrist's office considering medication for depression and anxiety for the first time in my life. I was strung out. I felt helpless, I felt overwhelmed, I was frankly exhausted, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. After about half an hour of answering her questions, my psychiatrist tilted her head and she asked me, have you ever considered that you might have ADHD? When I was 21 years old, in August of 2018, this last year, I was diagnosed with ADHD and my whole worldview changed. See, when she asked me if I had memory issues, I found myself sobbing in her office. I had so much shame around these things that I'd been covering up my whole life. I thought that ADHD looked like that, like young, hyperactive little boys or college students faking a diagnosis to get medication and finish their homework. I had so much prejudice around this possibly being a part of my life. And I'm sure many of you have images of this when you think of ADHD too, which is why I want to stand up here and talk to you about why it's really necessary to nuance these narratives and understand what's really going on. So what is it? Let's clarify what ADHD actually is. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder that happens in the brain, right? So it's a brain difference. And essentially what's happening is the neural circuits that are engaged in decision making in ADHD brains differ than in neurotypical brains. So it's a really measurable disorder that you can look at when you look at these scans of brains, right? And these symptoms manifest in two primary types. So there's primary inattentive type and the primary hyperactive type, which is the one that's a little easier to diagnose because it's more visible. It's helpful for me to describe ADHD as a disorder of executive function. When I say this, I mean executive function is the decision making that goes into deciding what we're doing and when we're doing it. And this is helpful because I can show you some examples of executive function as collected by a freelance writer named Mary on their blog, Through Reason. So if you look through these, we work on all of these executive functions like thousands of times a day without even thinking about them. And they're important for our everyday life. And what makes someone with ADHD different, and for that reason, basically anyone with any sort of mental illness or invisible illness or disorder, is that everyone is having issues with this, right? Everyone forgets things and loses things and has trouble organizing stuff. What makes it special if you have ADHD is the level to which it's actually impairing your life and where that's coming from, where those difficulties are coming from. Just as someone who's sad once doesn't have depression, someone who forgets something doesn't have ADHD. You can have issues with those and not have ADHD, and you can have ADHD and not exhibit classic symptoms. So these executive functions are the thing that draws all cases of ADHD together, where everyone who does have ADHD has issues with at least some of these. And to make this visible to you, I, on the next slide, have highlighted all of these functions that I struggle with over 10 times a day, most of them more. Which is why it makes this a really personalized disorder, because some people maybe actually don't have a super hard time focusing like we think of with ADHD, but they might have a hard time with others of these executive functions. So on a more personal level, I'm going to describe to you right now what it's like for me and my personal experience of ADHD in a way that I think is helpful for those who don't experience it. So imagine that you're in a room and there's a door on the other side of the room, and you have to get to that door and walk through it. You see how big the door is, you know you can fit in it, and you know that if you walk there, you can get there, and you know that it's possible, right? But when you look down at the floor, your vision starts to blur. And so you can't see the floor properly in front of you that you have to walk to get there. And then when you start walking, which it takes a while to do because you're so nervous that you might screw up on the way there and not make it, the floor starts to get bumpy, and then you start tripping. And so every time you trip, you have to get up and start over again. And then finally, after so much work and so much time, you get to the door, and you look over and you see that someone else has gotten to the door too. But for them, they were just able to look at the floor, and it was flat, and they could walk there. They still had to walk, but at least they could see where they're going. So for me, that's what it feels like when I have a task in front of me and I can't figure out how to actually execute it. And I wanted to describe it in all of these ways and in this complicated way, because it's not simply enough to turn to ADHD's DSM-V criteria, which is how we symptomize and diagnose illnesses, because it's actually borderline offensive. One of the symptoms of ADHD in its DSM-V criteria is makes careless mistakes, which suggests that someone with ADHD doesn't care about what they're doing, and that this is some sort of personality trait. And another one is interrupts people often. Which is true. My friends and family will know that I have issues with speaking over people and interrupting them, and I'm aware of it and working on it. But what it's not talking about is how it's more complicated than that. Because oftentimes that comes from impulsivity issues that happen with ADHD, and also a disconnect between speaking and listening that can be really difficult to transition to. And also the knowledge that's so ingrained in you that your memory's so bad that when you think of something to respond to something or say something, you feel like you have to say it right away or you're never going to remember it again. So all of these contribute to this one symptom that's just sort of described in a sentence. So who has ADHD? So it's important to say that most ADHD research has been on children. It's very much the focus of this disorder. So about almost 10% of children 2 to 17 years old have been diagnosed with ADHD, or will be. 2 out of 3 children with ADHD have at least one other mental, emotional, behavioral disorder. This is oftentimes autism or different anxiety disorders, social anxiety disorders. 13% of men will be diagnosed, but only 4.2% of women, which we'll get into later. Less than 20% of adults with ADHD actually seek help for it. There's a lot of stigma around this disorder, so that's part of this issue. And the average age of diagnosis is 7 years old. Also, 41.3% of adult ADHD cases are considered severe. And when I say severe, I mean it's severely impacting that person's life, whether it be work, personal, or other. Now to the scary statistics. Adults with ADHD are 5 times more likely to speed and 50% more likely to be in a serious car crash. Adults with ADHD are 3 times more likely to be dead by the age of 45. We're also 12 times more likely to have loss of control eating syndrome. So this, partnered with low self-esteem in high school, created the perfect environment for me to develop bulimia. Also, substance abuse for those with untreated ADHD is 3 to 4 times the national average. And this brings up the issue that there is serious detriment to struggling with these symptoms and not getting validation of a diagnosis of what's going on. It makes sense that you then turn to other substances or other things to feel control over your life. But I thought it was overdiagnosed. Okay, this is something that I really want to touch on, and essentially why I'm here today. ADHD is considered an overdiagnosed illness, as in people are being worried that it's becoming a fad. And there's weight to that, because in an early 2000s period, over about 10 years, there was a 43% increase in the amount of diagnoses. And that's a serious issue. I don't want to sit here and discredit the claims of worries about the pharmaceutical industry taking over. I 100% agree that that's something to touch on. But what I really want to stress is that it's possible for a disorder to be both overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. As in, it's overdiagnosed in certain populations and underdiagnosed and really difficult to get a diagnosis in others. So it's very underdiagnosed in, you guessed it, women and people of color. So women and people of color are almost 70% less likely to get a positive diagnosis for ADHD, which is meaning that there's a lot of people struggling on the margins here to actually get their symptoms recognized and validated, then are turning to other things to deal with it. A very particular study that I find interesting is one that was done in 2014 that focused on specifically young girls, and noticed that physicians and doctors have such a low level of clinical suspicion with young girls than they do compared to young boys. And that's primarily because young girls exhibit mostly the inattentive type of ADHD versus the hyperactive, which is a lot harder to diagnose. And so they also found that young girls and young women develop way better coping strategies to mask their symptoms. And there's a lot of reasons why this could be the case, of feeling the pressure that you have to pretend like everything's fine. And also thinking about the fact that we have a lot of stereotypes about women being multitaskers. So if you can't focus on one thing, maybe that's not a problem. So there's a lot going into this, right? And then a couple of other issues are that it's incredibly hard to get a diagnosis if you don't live in a primarily English-speaking household. There's a lot lower numbers there, and if you don't have health insurance, this is a huge access barrier for people. So, on medication, another important topic. The primary types of ADHD medication that I'm sure you guys have heard of are Adderall and Ritalin. These are heavily abused on college campuses. But I want to just quickly touch on what they actually are. So people with ADHD have differing levels of norepinephrine and dopamine, people with neurotypical brains. And what that means is our reward systems, as far as distracting stimuli around us, are very different. And so we're not experiencing the same sort of regulation for distraction as people with neurotypical brains. So when we take Adderall or Ritalin and other ADHD medications, what that's doing is it's normalizing those levels and allowing us to focus. And so this is why it actually affects people very differently who have ADHD and people who don't. So people who abuse this type of medication, oftentimes they'll feel sort of like high-strung or hyped up and able to just really bang out everything they're doing. And this makes sense, it's an amphetamine. But for those of us that actually use this really diligently for our ADHD, it can present very differently. So for me, when I take my medication, it actually slows down. I actually slow down, and for me, it's the difference between being able to know how long 10 minutes actually is, or being able to talk to someone for 15 minutes and actually remember and go along with what they're saying. So it's these little things. If we go back to the idea of a room with a door in front of you, for me, it's essentially like putting on glasses, that I can see the floor in front of me, and I can see the steps that I need to get somewhere. So it's very effective. Which is why it makes it incredibly frustrating that it's so abused. And to give you an idea of this, it's really hard to find reliable statistics on ADHD medication abuse in colleges because it's changing so rapidly and it's increasing at such a high pace. So in 2013, it was around 10% of college students that abused ADHD medication, but it's increased significantly since then. So we don't really have reliable statistics right now. It's hard to find them, but we do know it's much higher than that. And the difficulty with this and the real problem with this is that a lot of the times now psychiatrists and doctors on college campuses or even in college towns aren't prescribing this medication to people who need it because they're so scared it's going to create a market. And so that meant that it was actually quite a hurdle for me to be able to get medicated, even though I'm using this medication very scarcely in low doses and at a very well-regulated pace and with other types of treatment, right? So it's not just a one-size-fits-all type of thing. So I want some takeaways here. What can we do? So one, please change how you talk about ADHD. It's not an adjective. So when someone says, oh, I'm so ADHD right now, please let them know that it is an actual disorder. It's a brain difference, quite similar to something like autism, that presents very differently in different people, and that it is a disorder of executive function. So now all of you have this vocabulary that you can help people talk about it. Especially in terms of medication. So calling Adderall and Ritalin ADHD medication is very useful because it helps it so people who are abusing it, it's one step further that they have to go from disconnecting it from its actually intended use for people that really can use it and it can benefit them. And also just understanding that it can present so differently, right? So this idea of ADHD just being young kids who can't focus is so harmful, and that's why it's overdiagnosed, but that's also why it's underdiagnosed. So I was always very good in school. I was able to sit down and talk to someone for a long time, and those are all reasons why I was struggling for so long and not having the help I needed. And that's because my struggles of executive function were different than what is typically thought of when we think of ADHD. It's not a focus disorder, it's a disorder of executive function. So that's one thing we can do to change our vocabulary around this. And also understand what you're saying when you say it's overdiagnosed. So again, that is an issue, it's important. But I get preached to about how my illness is inaccurate or how my disorder and diagnosis is inaccurate about 3 times a week. So 3 times a week I have to sit down to someone and talk to them for half an hour about how actually I promise you I know my struggles better than you do, and how ADHD is a real thing and that yes, it is overdiagnosed, but also underdiagnosed in other populations. And so it's great to just let people know that it's always more complicated than that, right? To use a very common sociology student term, it's more complicated. So just please let people know about that and know that there are populations that it's very, very difficult to get diagnosed and that those are issues. And lastly, be an ally. And when I say this, I mean, you know, sitting here and listening to this talk is wonderful and I appreciate all of your time so much. But also taking what you've learned here today and using it to be a better friend, to be a better peer to people who are dealing with this. So if your friend does disclose to you that they have ADHD, even asking the question, how do your symptoms present themselves, and can I help you as your friend in any way, can be really helpful. So for me, I know just knowing that my friends are aware that if I space out or don't remember what they said, it's not because I don't care. It decreases my anxiety by like 100%. So just being that person and knowing that that these things are things that people can't always control, and that if you can be a better friend by understanding ways in which you can support people, and understanding ways in which ADHD can actually be a benefit. So there are things in which our brains can do better than neurotypical people's brains, can be really helpful too. And that goes for teachers as well. It's really helpful to make plans with students to make sure that you can both succeed with each other. And that's all I have for you. So thank you so much for your time and focusing on me.